The golden light of late afternoon spread across the valley like honey, and studied the log she'd just wrestled into place. Her auburn hair, streaked now with threads of silver, escaped from its braid and caught the breeze. At 53, she knew her own strength and her own limitations. She'd been building this cabin for 3 months now, one log at a time. Some people thought she was crazy. A woman alone, starting over, building a home with her own 2 hands. But Margaret had learned long ago that sometimes the only way forward is to simply begin. The divorce had been finalized last spring. 28 years of marriage ended with signatures on paper. Her children were grown, living their own lives in distant cities. The house they'd raised them in felt too full of echoes, so she'd sold it. This land, this valley with its rolling hills and whispering pines, had called to her like a promise. She didn't notice the rider at first. He'd been there for a while, sitting quietly on his horse at the edge of her property, watching her work. Not in a threatening way, more like someone watching a campfire, drawn to its warmth and light. His name was Thomas, though she wouldn't learn that until later. He was 57, with weathered hands and eyes that carried the weight of loss. He ran cattle on the neighboring ranch, the land his grandfather had homesteaded. 3 years ago, his wife Sarah had passed after a long illness. The house he went home to each evening was clean and orderly, but empty in ways that had nothing to do with furniture. Margaret bent to lift another log, her light blue work shirt dusty from the day's labor. She was strong for her size, but this one was heavy. She adjusted her grip, took a breath, and began to lift. "Ma'am," a voice called out, gentle and respectful. "Would you accept some help?" She turned, startled. The cowboy sat astride a brown mare with a white blaze, his hat tipped back enough to show his face. There was kindness there, and something else. A loneliness she recognized because she carried it herself. "I don't want to intrude," he continued, dismounting slowly, reading her hesitation. "Just seems like that log could use 2 sets of hands instead of 1. Margaret hesitated. She'd been so determined to do this herself, to prove something, though she wasn't entirely sure what or to whom. But there was no pride in stubbornness, her grandmother used to say, and sometimes accepting help was its own kind of strength. "I'd appreciate that," she said. They worked together in companionable silence, lifting the log into place. He moved with the economy of someone who'd done physical labor all his life, but there was a gentleness in how he handled the wood, as if it deserved respect. "I'm Thomas," he said when the log was secured. "I run the cattle ranch just over that rise." "Margaret," she replied. "And this is—" "Well, this will be my home eventually." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It's good work. Building something with your own hands makes it mean more." Over the following weeks, Thomas began riding by in the late afternoons. He never presumed, never pushed. He'd simply ask if she could use an extra pair of hands for an hour. Sometimes she said yes. Sometimes she said she needed to work alone that day, and he'd nod and ride on without offense. Slowly, between the lifting and the sawing and the fitting of logs, they began to talk. Margaret told him about her children, Rachel, who was teaching music in Portland, and David, who'd become a veterinarian in Montana. She spoke of the marriage that had simply worn away over time, like water over stone, until one day they'd looked at each other and realized they'd become strangers. Thomas talked about Sarah, how they'd met at a county fair when they were barely 20, how she'd wanted children but they'd never been blessed that way, how he'd cared for her through 2 years of illness, and how the hardest part now wasn't the grief itself, but having no one to share the small moments with. The sunrise, the first snow, the taste of coffee in the morning. "I think that's what I miss most about being married," Margaret said one evening as they sat on the cabin's completed foundation, sharing a thermos of coffee she'd brought. "Not the big things, but the small ones. Having someone to tell about the hawk I saw that morning, or the funny thing I heard on the radio." Thomas was quiet for a moment, watching the sun paint the clouds orange and pink. "Sarah used to collect recipes," he said. "She'd clip them from magazines, write them on cards. After she passed, I found boxes of them. She never cooked half of them. Just liked the idea of them, I think." The possibility, he paused. "I still have all those cards. Can't bring myself to throw them away." "Don't," Margaret said softly. "They're not just recipes. They're pieces of her heart." As summer deepened into fall, the cabin took shape. Walls rose. A roof went on. Windows were fitted. And something else was being built too, though neither of them named it at first. It was there in the way Thomas would bring lunch sometimes. Sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and how they'd sit together in comfortable silence. It was there in how Margaret found herself listening for the sound of hoofbeats in the afternoon, and how her heart would lift when she heard them. One October evening, with the cabin nearly finished, Thomas arrived with something in his saddlebag. "I brought you something," he said, almost shy. He pulled out a small wooden box, handmade, the wood smooth from careful sanding. "For your new home, to keep things in. Important things." Margaret opened it, running her fingers over the craftsmanship. Inside, he'd carved a single word into the lid: possibilities. Her eyes filled with tears. "Thomas, I know we're both at an age where we ought to be wise," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "where we ought to know better than to hope for new beginnings. But watching you build this cabin log by log, day by day, you taught me something. It's never too late to start over. Never too late to build something new." Margaret set down the box and took his weathered hands in hers. "I came here thinking I needed to be alone," she said, "that I needed to prove I could do everything by myself. But you know what I learned? Being independent doesn't mean being alone. And accepting help, accepting companionship, that's not weakness. That's wisdom." "I'd like to help you finish this cabin," Thomas said. "And then, if you're willing, I'd like to keep coming by, not just to help with building, but just to be, to share the coffee and the sunsets, to have someone to tell about the hawks and the funny things on the radio." "I'd like that," Margaret said, and she smiled, a real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes and the heart. They finished the cabin together as autumn painted the valley in gold and crimson. And while it was Margaret's home, built with her own determination and sweat, it became something more too. It became a place where two people who'd thought their chances for companionship had passed found something unexpected. Not a replacement for what they'd lost, but something new. Something built, like the cabin itself, one day at a time with patience and care and hope. On Thanksgiving, Margaret's children came to visit, and she introduced them to Thomas. They saw how he looked at their mother and how she looked at him, and they were glad. Rachel would later tell her friends that it was like watching spring come after a long winter, not dramatic, but inevitable and right. Thomas brought Margaret to meet his ranch, showed her the land his grandfather had worked, the house that had been so empty. "I'm not asking you to leave your cabin," he said. "I'm just saying there's room in my life, room in my home, if you ever want to share it. We have time to figure that out," Margaret said, taking his hand. "That's the gift of where we are now. We know that love doesn't have to be rushed. It can grow slow and steady like good timber," and so it did. Two people in the autumn of their lives finding not a fairy tale, but something better, something real. A companionship built on understanding, on shared work and shared silence, on the courage to begin again. The cabin stood in the valley, solid and true, a testament to what one woman could build with determination. But it became a symbol of something more, too, that we're never too old to start over, never too broken to heal, never too lonely to find connection. Sometimes, the best things in life come not when we're searching desperately for them, but when we're simply doing the work in front of us, one log at a time, staying open to the possibility that grace might arrive on horseback, offering help, offering companionship, offering hope.